Yee! Hey guys, Tiffany here, and I'm the owner of Tiffany Gordon Cosplay LLC, which is a company that focuses on costume and prop fabrication as well as education. And I'm excited to bring you a monster of a build, and this one was a really fun project, and I'm excited to share with you how I made it. And if you're new to the channel, I'd love to have you as part of our community, so like the video and subscribe to the channel. But this monster of a build I did specifically for a convention called Monsterpalooza, and I was going to make this ginormous sword. And I was gonna do a live painting of it at the convention. So first I had to make it, and this is gonna be a tutorial on how to make it, not necessarily how to paint it, as I painted it live in person. But I think this will be really helpful for those that want to make either this specific prop or make another large type of prop or weapon. And I hope you find this helpful. But without further ado, this is how I made Soul Edge from the game Soul Calibur. And you can see it's a bit big, but this is all foam with a PVC bone structure. And I'm excited to share with you how I made it. So let's begin. And here's the list of all the tools and materials that I used for making this sword, and I'll have links to everything in the description, including the foam, as well as my blueprint you can find on my website, TiffanyGordonCosplay.com, link in the description. Now, this sword is ginormous, and it took a full sheet of foam just to cut out one piece of the sword. So do be aware you will need a full piece of new foam. And for this, I'm using 10mm HD foam. And from my blueprint, I cut off of the bottom part, the blade section, and I traced out just what part would be flat onto the foam. And then before cutting it out, I wanted to heat treat the foam. And for this, I got out my heat gun and heat treated it all. This way, I didn't have to worry about this later on in the process. And then I could cut out the foam using a box cutter and a cutting mat. And I'll note that you also want to do this twice, because you'll want one for the top part and one for the bottom. And then next I cut out a bunch of strips of 10mm foam. And I will note that for this process, we're basically going to be making a cube or a box. It's gonna have this hollow space on the inside, and we're gonna be filming that up. And the width needs to be determined based off of the size of the PVC pipe that you're gonna use for your main support structure for the handle and just for the interior of this sword. And for me, this was 2 inches, but it's gonna really just depend on what thickness of pipe you use for your sword. As well as the other part that we're gonna need to cut out is the blade section. And for my blueprint, we'd already cut off the blade section. And for this, I basically just added to the bottom part another 2 inches, and I cut out that shape. This way the blade would not shrink in size when we start to make it 3-dimensional. And you'll want to do this part twice as well. And at this point, this is all of the pieces of foam that I have cut out of 10mm. Now to talk about the pipe part of this sword. And for me, because I was going to California with this, and I don't live in California, I had to ship the entire sword there. And for it to actually fit in a box, I ended up having to have the handle part detached from the sword, which in reality, I don't recommend this if you're just making the sword, because it's really not going to help you at all. But for me, I had to do it. So that's why this process is going to be like this, but I'll explain how to do it without it. And basically for me, because it did have to come apart into 2 pieces, that means I had to use 2 different sizes of pipe. So I used a 2-inch pipe for the handle, and then for the inside sword and the mail part that sticks out of the sword, I used a 1 1/2 inch PVC pipe. Now for you, I would recommend just doing 1 piece of pipe that was 2 inches all the way through. It'll be so much easier. So do it that way, don't make it come apart like me. But for me, how I got the length of each of my pieces is I got my blueprint, laid the pipe on top of it, and basically figured out the length of the handle part, which for me was the 2 inches pipe. And then I did a line through the rest of the sword almost all the way down. It was a good portion through the sword because I really wanted this structural piece on the inside so that way the sword wouldn't be floppy and everything, which it really wasn't at all. But for that piece, I then marked how long I wanted that and cut the pieces with a bandsaw. And now to kind of show you what the interior of the sword's going to look like. And for me, to calculate all of the pieces, you're going to want a long straight ruler so that way you can draw all your lines on there. And basically I started off with the center, knowing how far my pipe was going to go. And because we are using 10mm foam throughout this build, I made sure that the width of each of my lines was 10mm. And this is going to be basically guidelines of where I was going to put all of the foam inside of the sword, because this is going to help to keep our sword's shape more of a box and not get squished. So basically there is long ones going the length of the sword, and then I have small, short little bits that are going to help separate those pieces and structurally make this sword sound. And now that we got that figured out, we can go and start gluing. And for this, you're gonna use a lot of contact cement glue. And a reminder, with any type of glue like this, you will want to use a respirator. And I basically covered the entire pieces of the foam of the main sword part, all of the edges of all of our rectangle pieces as well. And for contact cement glue, if you haven't used it before, basically you need to apply it on whatever sides you want to touch together. You will wait for that glue to dry before you start to attach the pieces. And now to start assembling. So we're gonna take first our base that we drew all of our fancy dancy lines on, and we're going to do the outer shape of this sword. Basically, we will cover all of the sides so that way we can start building up the shape of our box sword. And then you can also start adding your interior supports as well. Until your piece looks something like this in the end. Then for attaching the pipe, and for this pipe, for me was 1.2 inches, but I do recommend you using the 2-inch pipe instead, just so that way it'll fit snug. And for attaching it, I like to use my hot glue gun, which was provided by Surebonder, and the Surebonder hot glue, as this helps to adhere the best to foam, and applied a ton onto the bottom part, and then inserted my pipe, and then continued to fill the top part. And as I said, because my pipe was 1.5 inches, I did have to fill a little bit of a gap, so I did cut a little bit of foam that I inserted into this piece, but you shouldn't have to if you're doing the 2-inch pipe. And here's what it looks like now. Notice that there's a bit of the pipe sticking out from the top part where the handle is gonna be. This is gonna be the middle piece for me that the handle is going to slide onto, but for you, it should most likely be the full length of your handle rather than this little nub. Then back to more gluing, and I applied more contact cement glue to the top part of all of these pieces. Then waited for it to dry and slowly connected my edges to create a full enclosed box of this sword shape. Reminder that the blade section is still not on this as well. And a quick bit before we keep going on to the blade section of this sword is, if you are happening to make your handle detach from the actual sword, you will need to add a little bit of a tension part. And for this, I use 2mm foam. This is gonna help with the difference of your two pieces of pipe. For me, again, one was 1.5 inch and the other pipe was 2 inches. So you will need to kind of have that offset. This will make it so you have a snug fit in the end. And then on to the blade sections. And at this point, you should have 2 pieces of that blade shape cut. And I then drew a guideline that is about 1.5 inches away from the bottom part of the blade. And for this, we're gonna use our box cutter and cut at an angle between the guideline and the bottom edge line, cutting that to remove the foam. And then to your sanding station to sand that cut edge so it's nice and clean. And for this, I use my Dremel and a sanding drum. And now that our edge is nice and clean, we can apply our contact cement glue to both pieces of that, wait for it to dry, and then we're going to slowly start to connect it. And we're basically going to be making a triangle-like shape. Starting at the tip, connect the two edges and slowly work your way towards the other side. Then apply more glue to the other edge as well as to where it's going to attach on your sword. And once the glue is dry, you can start to attach it. And I started at the side that would have the handle first, working my way down towards the tip. And because our sword part that we had made originally was a box, at the very end you will have this kind of boxy like point at the tip of the sword. And for me, what I did was I simply got my box cutter and just cut it to the shape of the blade portion. And if you have any little holes showing, we can fix that later because we're going to be adding foam clay anyway. And that's pretty much how I got the base shape of this sword. Now it is time to start adding the details. First, starting off with the blade, cutting the little spike parts that are chipped into it. And I just drew on where I wanted to cut and got my box cutter and cut those parts. Then I got my blueprint. I cut it so that way it was only the middle section that would have all of the veins and the gore part. And I traced that onto both sides of the sword, so that way it'd give me a good indication of where I'm going to start applying my stuff, as well as I cut out the oval-like shape for the eyeball and traced that as well. And I knew I was gonna be using a ton of pieces of foam dowels, and I just used whatever I had laying in the house, and that was half round and as well as triangle foam dowels. And I kind of just traced where I wanted it to be in different sections and taped it down so I got a good indication. And then once again applied contact cement glue, this time to the back of the foam dowels as well as to the sword part, and started to lay them down. Now this is just a generic spot placement. We're going to be adding more later, don't you worry. As well as there's a bit of on the top part by the handle and on the top section of the back part of the sword, there's a little bit more mass. So I wanted to build up the foam there. So I cut in 2 to 3 layers of 10mm foam and added that to that section. And now that we have the basic thickness of everything that we want on this sword, it is time to start adding the actual textures and things. And for this, we're going to be using foam clay. And for using foam clay, you want to wet the surface of the sword where you want the foam clay to attach. This is going to be your glue in a way without using actual glue. And then your first goal is to basically just cover the sword with the foam clay where it's supposed to go, to be the skin and the blood vessel areas, and focus on just having it on the sword. Don't worry about the details right now, just focus on getting it on. And then reminder that foam clay will dry slowly, so you do need to go back and forth by adding more water onto the surface. Then once you get it covered on one side, you can start adding more layers to it and adding more thickness. And I like to use clay working tools to kind of help pinch and make lines a little bit more straight and make more depth into places. Reminder with foam clay, it will shrink and lower. So whatever amount of mass you put on that surface, it is slowly going to shrink down and not be as high once it starts to dry. Which is why I always recommend adding actual pieces of HT foam underneath to help give that height. And here is kind of what it looks like so far. Now a little venture away from the sword, and we're gonna go towards the handle again. And for me, because I was going to be painting this live and I was gonna have it sitting for a long time, I needed to make sure it had a really good hilt part. So I ended up 3D modeling the shape of just the hilt's top part, so that way it had a good base to sit on for the duration of a convention while I painted it. And I just 3D printed it and epoxied it to the end, and I made it the thickness of 10mm to sit around the pipe, so that way I could just add a strip of 10mm foam around the handle. But you do not need to do the 3D printed part. This was merely for me for the convention. You can make this part out of foam. And this piece also had more of the blood vessels coming up towards the handle. I did want to make sure that it was attached onto the sword with the blade part, and put some of my foam dowel rods on there, and then I also covered this section with foam clay. And now on to the eyeball, and I tried a few different methods, and I found that the easiest way was actually to use a styrofoam ball. And I used a 4-inch styrofoam ball that I cut in half, both halves on either side of the sword, and then I applied some contact cement glue and attached it. Reminder, contact cement glue will a little bit melt the styrofoam up, so only use this on the underside that's going to attach to the foam and not onto the top part. And then once again, put my foam clay on top of this piece. And for trying to mimic the iris and the people and everything, I ended up using a bunch of different round circles. So one was the top of a spray can that I put the lid to make a perfect circle, and then I had some gem lube that I put on top to make the smaller circle. So I had perfect circles, and then I could kind of do more details onto the piece with my clay working tools. And this is pretty much what I ended up with and the final result of my finished fabricating parts of this sword. And I'm really happy with the final outcome. Yes, there's improvements that I could do on it, but I had to make this so fast because I basically had to have this completed and dried, and then I had to do a base coat of Plasti-Dip and a base coat of my silver paint before shipping it to California, and I needed a good week to make sure it got there in time. So there was a whole bunch of things I had to do with this to make sure it got there way in advance. But I'm really happy with how it looked, and at the convention, here's some of the footage of me painting it, which was a lot of fun to do live painting. Painting is one of my favorite things to do in general, but it was a lot of fun to bring it out and talk to some people that were coming by about the painting process. But I'll also say it was a bit stressful as I had to make sure that I had already planned out how I was gonna paint the whole thing over these 3 days and make sure my time management was really well done. Also, the lighting was awful. I ended up bringing one of my own lights, but it still was pretty dark, and I'll say I'll probably go back in the future and repaint some of it as the colors ended up being quite a bit different than what I wanted just because of the lighting, but I'm still really happy with what I did. For those that are curious, all the paints that I used was provided by Cratex Colors, as well as my airbrush gun and compressor were provided by Iwata Eclipse. And I'm really grateful that they brought me out to do this at Monsterpalooza, and I could make this sword for you.
And that, guys, is how I made this sword, Soul Edge from the game Soul Calibur. One thing I did forget to mention at the beginning is, actually, it comes apart into 2 pieces. Not really very transportable still, but it does help a little bit. And the sword part comes apart from the handle, which does help a little bit. I still had to make a custom box, which I ended up just using a TV box to ship this to California for my live painting of the sword. But in reality, you're most likely just gonna make this one piece. But it still separates, and I hope you find this helpful for making your very own one. And if so, let me know in the comments, as well as don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. A big thank you to all of my company sponsors here on YouTube, as well as all of my YouTube members, specifically those legendary members who financially help to support me so I can continue bringing you more cosplay tutorials, as well as I can continue doing this as my full-time job and my main source of income. So I really appreciate your support, and I will see you for our next cosplay tutorial. Much love, guys!